Hello, this is Hazel from C-Trax Customer Support. This video describes how to use and set up the grid, how to change its colour and also affect the clarity of the grid if you find it's not sharp enough for you. We use the grid to position items accurately and to align things. And you can see the grid on the screen in front of you, which is made up of horizontal and vertical lines. When we draw lines or move parts or move tracks, anything you move within Excel Designer will always snap to the grid or the half grid points. So if I start to draw a line, you'll see that the corners in the lines are snapping to half grid points or grid points. This is the same in all of the editors. The size of the grid is always shown up in the top left corner of the screen. There are a variety of grids to choose from. Some vary in size as you zoom in and zoom out, others are fixed, and you can also define your own grid if for example, you wanted a different size in the X and the Y axis. So if we go up to look at the grid commands, we've got an inch and a metric grid at the top. They both behave in the same way in that they vary as you zoom in and zoom out. So if I choose the metric grid, but the inch one works in exactly the same way, you can see we've got a 2.5 mm grid defined. Now I'm going to zoom in using the function key F2 on the keyboard. And as I've zoomed in, you can see we've now got a 1 mm grid, one more level, 0.5 mm, to 0.25 and so on. And as I zoom back out using the function key F3, you can see the grid starts to get coarser again. So that's quite helpful if you're not too bothered about the actual size of the grid, but you want some fine adjustments, say when you're positioning text and things like that. The other options are 0.1 inch or 1 mm grid. They both work in the same way, but they are fixed at that size. So as we zoom in and out again, you'll see the grid just remains at that 0.1 inch size. Then the last one you've got is the user defined grid, and this is where we can specify a different value for the X and the Y axis, and you can specify in inches or millimeters. Now this grid is more often used in the component outline editor. For example, when you want to place pads at a specific pitch. So we use the grid, user defined, and say for example you had a metric pitch and it had to be 1.5 or 3 mm in the x-axis and 5 mm in the y-axis. You can see there the grid appears, and if we were to place some pads, we can place them in a row just very quickly. You can see that they've all snapped to that grid, and then the same coming along the bottom. So we'll just pop the original editor back onto the screen. Now I mentioned that as the flexible grids vary in size as you zoom in and zoom out, and that is controlled from the configuration folder and the grid auto pitch table. There are a selection of values entered into this window. One column is used for the inch values and the other for the metric values, and you can specify your own values just by selecting a value and typing in a new value. I don't want to make that change, so we'll just cancel the window. Now you might sometimes want to switch the grid snapping off, so you can do that if you want to, just using this grid snap to grid command, and just by selecting it, it toggles it on and off. So now when I draw a line, the line is actually snapping exactly where I position the cursor. I'm going to switch the grid snapping back on, and you can also turn the visibility of the grid on and off if you want to. So if you don't like to see the grid, you can switch it off, but the grid is still active if you've got the snap to grid selected. You can also turn the grid on and off using the G key on the keyboard. Now I've mentioned you can control the colour of the grid if you want to, and also how it looks. So in the schematic editor, if we go up to the Edit Preferences command and have a look at the colours, we can see we've got a colour selected for the grid, and you can just change it to any colour. So if we OK that, and now we've got quite an overpowering grid on the screen. The other option you've got is to change how it looks, and if we go to the same window, Edit Preferences, and under the Miscellaneous tab, we've got the Drawing Grid Display Mode. At the moment it's set to ruled, and we can set that to dotted, and now we've got the dotted grid. So some people like the lined grid, some people like the dotted grid. Personally, I like the lined grid that I had before with the colours that I had before, so I'm just going to go back in and reset it to what's called the modern scheme. In addition to those controls, you've also got the ability to alter the thickness of the grid lines. If you find that they're too fine and you want them a little bit thicker, or maybe they're too thick and you want them a little bit thinner, that is controlled from the Edit Display Adjustments window. And you can see we've got some settings that are common to all editors, some that only apply to the schematic editor, some the artwork editor. So the grid lines in particular in the schematic are controlled, or the thickness of the grid lines are controlled by this parameter here, and if you just click on it, and then you've got a slider bar that you can slide one way and the other to adjust the thickness of the grid lines. And if you find you're not comfortable with the lines as they stand, what I would suggest you do is you set them down to very fine and OK the window. You do have to close the editor and then reopen it to see the effect of the change. And then if you find that's too thin or too thick or whatever, then come back to this window and then set it up to the other end of the scale and see what that's like, and then work your way into a setting that you find agreeable. In this window you can also control, if you're using a dotted grid, the size of the grid dots. So if you find you're not really able to see them very well, you can increase their size, and you can also adjust their brightness using those settings. And you can see I tend to work with the grid up at its maximum intensity. The last thing to show you is the auto grid pitch change threshold setting, which sounds very complicated, but again it's got the slider bar that you can slide around, and what this does is it controls how fine the grid gets as you zoom in and out on the variable grid, which I showed you earlier on. So the higher this number, the finer the grid will get as you zoom in. So if you want lots of grid lines on the screen as you zoom in, make the value higher. If you want less grid lines on the screen as you zoom in and out, then make it lower. If you do change the settings and you think, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, you have got this Restore Defaults button down at the bottom, and that will set you back to the default settings that came with the system. So just a little bit more to show you regarding the grid, and we'll just pop across to the outline editor now. And we've got 3 more commands to have a look at under the grid commands, and they are Select Origin, Edit Origin and Clear Origin. What the Select Origin allows you to do is to choose your starting point for the grid. So as you see at the moment, we've got a component outline and all the pads are not on a grid point. And what you might want to do is, for instance, draw a line, a set distance from a particular pin, be it a mounting hole or one of the pins. So what we are going to do here is set up a user-defined grid that I want to, so that I can draw a line a set distance away from the pin. So we got to the user defined grid. I'm going to make the I want to start the line 12.5 millimeters from pin 1, and in the x-axis, and 5.5 millimeters below. So I've changed the grid, and you can see we've got the user defined grids on display that I selected, but it's not radiating from pin 1. So we use the grid select origin command, select pin 1, and now the grid is radiating from that particular pin. And if I were to draw a line, and if we go across, down and across, then we know that that starting point is 12.5 millimeters away in the X and 5.5 millimeters away in the Y from that pin 1, which was chosen as the origin for the grid. When you've moved the grid origin, up in the top right of the screen you've always got the word grid shift to tell you that the grid has actually been shifted. And then if we go back to the grid commands, you've got the clear origin command, and that will restore the grid origin from whence it came. You can also type in a grid shift as well. So if you know you want the grid shifted a set distance in the X and the Y from it, then you can type it in as well. So I think that's everything I wanted to talk to you about regarding the grid. So I hope it's maybe covered some things that you weren't aware of and you found it useful. So this is Hazel from C-Trax signing off. Bye.